All right, hello everyone. Digital forensics, this time on incident response. I'm Martin Schmiedecker, and today we're going to have a look at how incident response and in particular how methods of digital forensics can be integrated into incident response and how they overlap. So, incident response. Why incident response? Basically, there is a strong overlap between digital forensics and incident response. Mostly, the techniques and tools are very similar and related, but the main difference is that incident response comes with a time pressure, and usually you have more dynamic artifacts compared to digital forensics. Whereas in digital forensics, you usually have some form of hard drive, image system, snapshot, whatever it is. While in incident response, you're dealing with RAM contents, network connections, and indicators of compromise, trying to diminish an ongoing attack on a corporate network or against specific employees. In particular, for large companies, there's a great interest in incident response, mostly because an infection with malware can spread much easier in a closely controlled environment, such an enterprise network. Companies usually fail in detecting intrusions timely. So there has been a Gartner study or some other management related group that estimated it takes about 100 days from the initial breach until it is detected. And this is clearly too long. There have been notable cases where basically a breach hasn't been investigated in time and had kind of a fallout for the company. So one is Ashley Madison. They have been breached. Their dubious economic practices have been revealed. Not sure if the company is still up and running, but at least all the user data got leaked online. Hacking Team was or is Italian-based supplier of Trojan software for lawful interception. It's kind of ironic that the name Hacking Team is also that they got hacked. RSA, the company which was manufacturing time-based dongles for your keychain, they have been hacked and lost the seeds used for seeding the time-based dongles for two-factor authentication, and they haven't lost them just once but twice. In subsequent attacks, for example against Northrop, the attackers abused that they had access to the two-factor codes to gain access to corporate networks. Also, Google, in particular, Operation Aurora, is kind of noteworthy because Google got hacked big time. The attackers had access to the Gmail source code, and since then, Google has tremendously stepped up their game regarding security posture in that they do not want this to happen again. You can read it up on basically any news site or Wikipedia and read how the attackers got in and what they had for an aim. And of course, there's Stuxnet. Stuxnet is a particular example. That's why it's in brackets, because it was built to stay stealthy. But again, it was an intrusion. It wasn't detected in time. So it serves as an example here as well. The difference between live forensics and incident response now is that the artifacts are broader. So you have less hard drive analysis, you have more of network artifacts and RAM contents. Usually you have the entire network of a company, if it's a flat network, or a specific user base, and time is often an issue. Basically, there are two approaches to deal with this, to collect artifacts at runtime from the client machines. One is log-based, the other one is agent-based. Log-based is, in essence, it forwards all the event logs of the local machine to a central entity, a central logging server, versus agent-based, where you have a local agent, software agent running, and can task it with tasks for analyzing whether or not this particular host has been infected with that malware. The first well-documented instance of incident response I could find was that a hacker gained access to, I think it was a Unix-based system back in 1986 at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Clifford Stahl, he's a physicist, and he was tasked with analyzing why there was an error in the billing on used time allocation on that machine. And what he found out was basically that there was a hacker dialing in from Germany, and he was spying for the Soviets. Basically, what Stahl, once he discovered that there is someone who is not accounted for the resources he or she uses, he identified that account. He used a printer for storing the communication content. In essence, all it did was to hook a printer to the wired connection, like the dial-up connection. So he was able to print every character that was going back and forth whenever that hacker logged in. He also deployed decoy files that were large in size to basically trap the attacker in that connection to prolong the connection time, so that the telephone company that was in charge of running that phone line was able to trace it back to Germany. It's an excellent book, The Cuckoo's Egg. I can highly recommend it. Christmas is coming up, so if you're one of those persons that already has everything there is, make it a book, and The Cuckoo's Egg won't disappoint you. There's also a technical paper, Stalking the Wily Hacker. Have a look at it. Remember, it's from the mid-80s, and how they figured out what the exploits were and how the attacker operated. So usually in incident response, the goal is to kind of react to some event. That event could be a malicious email attachment. It could be a suspicious domain that has been looked up by one of the clients. It could be a proxy log connection, whatever it is. Something pops up, and the goal is usually then to prevent and contain further infections, and basically figuring out what is happening and how it could be stopped if it's still going on, and if, for example, sensitive data has been exfiltrated. Ideally, it's live forensics under time pressure, meaning that usually it's a few emails that have been received on the central mail gateway. You would like to identify those, and you would like to identify those emails in time prior to a user opening them. Once the attacker is within the network, like some user clicked on the attachment or activated macros in the weaponized document, you would like to move faster than the attacker, like to prevent and contain, lateral movement for the attacker to move to different hosts. And ideally, of course, you would like to have that remotely without the need to physically go there. So you have a team that is specifically on watch to investigate suspicious activities, and they are remotely working without having to go to that infected or possibly infected machine. So the exploitation procedure is usually the same. You have some reconnaissance phase where the attacker tries to figure out what the victim is using, which systems, which host systems he or she are hosting. names, positions, basically everything that is useful in an attack. The attack is then delivered. Nowadays, this is an email with a weaponized attachment or with a phishing link in there, which mimics either a receipt, a fraudulent receipt, or a login page to steal user credentials. Once the user either clicks or enters his or her credentials, that's the exploitation phase. Then some malware is installed, which phones home, receives command and control communication, and from that the machine is compromised. The attacker can move laterally in the network to figure out where to get elevated privileges, and once that happened, data is exfiltrated that is of interest. Basically, this is the cyber kill chain, and even though I despise the usage of the word cyber, it is useful in that extent here. So the Mitre attack framework was basically derived to, instead of having to rely on email addresses or other exploits in use, attackers usually follow a pattern in the techniques and the tools that they use. And the attack framework is basically built to categorize attackers into specific categories to make them comparable. Meaning that even though exploits can change over time, the tactics and the used procedures are usually rather constant. There are also specific adaptations available. So one is for mobile and the other one is for industrial control systems in how an attacker can operate. This is basically how it can look like. No need to read it all or learn it in any way. Just keep in mind this is the Mitre Attack Navigator, and it provides an overview of the controls and attack patterns that are commonly used in an attack. So on the left you have the reconnaissance phase, where an attacker could be using active scanning or getting organizational information, searching open databases. These things could be used. Then initial access is established. This could be a drive-by compromise on a popular website. It could be a hardware addition. It could be supply chain attack. And once the attacker is in there, usually have some form of persistence, meaning an attacker would like to have the possibility to come back at a later point in time. You have some privilege escalation, meaning that an attacker usually elevates privileges to get domain admin or super user privileges. Then there's the lateral movement. Then there's command and control to exfiltrate data. And basically upon finishing the exploitation, there's usually some impact, meaning that to hide traces, disks are wiped, or some other mean is used to hide the tracks that the attacker has been leaving in those systems. This is a screenshot from the CrowdStrike report, threat hunting report. What they did in this picture is they categorized the different observable events that they have been investigating and made a heat map on how an attacker used to basically work within the Mitre attack framework and executed their attack. What you can see is, for example, initial access is usually from valid accounts, meaning that users are phished or credentials are reused. Privilege escalation, valid accounts, defense evasion, valid accounts. Basically, in the end, the attacker is able or often able to get valid credentials and work from there within the network. I linked it below. Have a look at it. It's not only marketing, but there's also interesting insights there as well. So items of interest during incident response. So once you got the lead that something might be going on that is not intended, usually what you would like to do is to get a list of the running processes, get a RAM dump to figure out what is happening and if there are processes that are hiding there. Network, usually not that of an interest because usually you have them locked in a corporate environment. So you have DNS traces, you have proxy logs, and you can get to them at a later point in time, while as a local machine is not as closely monitored as the central entities like a web proxy. You would like to assess stored files and see what kind of files have been accessed, modified, or created on that particular machine. And yeah, basically at a later point in time, you would like to analyze the malware, but that's not part of the first steps of analysis to figure out what is going on. Yeah, some use cases. So as I mentioned already, there's a machine with some suspicious traffic, could be website, could be suspicious email with attachment, without attachment, and link. Whatever it is, you have gotten the lead that something is going on. You would also like to not only test this on just one machine, but like a network of machines. So one of the tasks could then be to acquire the RAM images of like that subnetwork. And you do not want to have to do this manually. So you would like to have procedures and processes in place that allow for capturing the RAM content on 30 or more machines. It might also be that there was a new advanced persistent threat report coming out from one of those security companies, and you would like to check for the artifacts described there, meaning that usually these reports analyze at great length the artifacts that such an malicious entity leaves behind, a specific malicious entity leaves behind, and you would like to know whether or not you are affected. Basically, yeah. Usually in these reports, you can find so-called indicators of compromise. So these are basically things that could lead to detect the infection. Could be, yeah, usually it's a rule, and if this rules is triggered, you might be investigating that machine further. These rules are written in standard XML and can be openly exchanged. So every report usually has some form of indicators of compromise accompanied in the appendix to basically allow, okay, this is a process name that looks suspicious, or this is a domain name, this is an IP address that has been used by the attackers, and you would like to figure out whether or not this is included in your data. Usually can include things like hash values, things like MD5 SHA-1 file hashes, which are usually not very useful for specific malwares because they can be easily changed during different malware families within the same malware family, so that you have 1,000 binaries and they all have a different hash value. It could be also file names or registry keys, but also mutex information, whatever it is that could describe the actions of a malicious software piece could be used to identify and serve as an indicator of compromise. On top of that, you could build Yara rules. Basically, it's a rule-based description language or markup language that allows for complex detection patterns in a way that one could generate one of those rules and have it then tested on either central systems or company-wide on the network. This is an example for a Yara rule. You have some descriptive tags saying this is just an example which has been observed in the wild. You then have 3 different strings that have been used or have been found to be identifiable to that particular software, and the condition for this rule to trigger is that either A, B, or C should be observable in a file or in a malware sample to be basically attributable to that rule. Based with these tools, you then usually have CSIRTs or CERTs, like Computer Emergency Response Team or Computer Security Incident Response Teams. Basically, these are the entities that are tasked with artifact acquisition and analysis of events. And most importantly, they cooperate and coordinate during events. In that they are the interface to the outside to relieve the investigators from numerous questions or things. They coordinate also with other CERTs to have the latest information available that there is. And they could be on different levels. So you could have a business unit CERT, you could have a business CERT for a company-wide network. You could have the nationwide CERT or even dedicated CERTs for specific things like grids or critical infrastructure. They also, when they cooperate, they usually use the so-called traffic light protocol to classify information in a very easy to grasp way. Usually traffic light protocol RAD means that only restricted recipients should be allowed to access this information. TLP Amber means that the disclosure is limited and should be kept within the same organization and not outside of that organization. TLP Green means it could be openly shared within the community, but not with the world. And TLP White usually means that it can be openly shared. This gives rather precise information for specific information and artifacts, whether or not someone who gets access to this information is allowed to share it and with whom. One of the first kind of network worms that has been publicly described and which also led to the creation of the first CERT was the so-called Morris worm. It was a computer worm in 1988 that abused vulnerabilities in SendMail and Finger to remote network software pieces. And one of the things that this worm did was it automatically spread to connected machines and tried to infect them. But a flaw in that in the code didn't stop the worm from infecting the same host multiple times. So basically, as soon as the host was infected, it could be reinfected over and over again until the resources of that host are depleted and it stopped working. Cleaning that host didn't give much because basically the same time it was connected, the worm was able to infect the host again and again and again until it was dead again. So there was an entity needed that coordinated cleaning events, shared the information, which hosts have been cleaned again, which have been patched, and which ones are safe to go back online. Timeline analysis is key during events, so everything that isn't documented is really hard to reconstruct at a later point in time. Try to document everything that might be of relevance at a later point in time, in particular which mitigation steps have been taken, who was informed at what time, and which specific steps have been decided upon, not only for you to have it as a documentation, but also to be able to provide some lessons learned afterwards, to adapt to the new situation that happened, and to basically gain some knowledge out of that to learn and improve. Timeline artifacts, so things that can feed a timeline. There are literally hundreds of different time stamp thingies in computer systems that could be useful. SleuthKit has the FLS plugin that allows to retrieve the file system metadata for every file. You could get all the modified create timestamps on a modern system. You could use log to timeline. There's a timeliner plugin for volatility, which takes the timestamps of process creation and termination, for example. Basically, computers love timestamps, and usually you're already interested in a specific point in time, which can narrow down the information sources that might be useful for that event. So, current threats, what is going on in enterprise security nowadays? Basically, what you can read again and again in the newspapers is that ransomwares are currently big in that they can infiltrate companies using spear phishing. I even read dynamite phishing, basically taking an old email and responding to both sender and receiver, having a context that is building on an established trust relationship, is currently the thing that can really infect hosts, machines, and the users behind them. You could have water holing attacks. So if you have a very specific company that is openly sharing information, could be used to modify those water holes. So if they use, I don't know, a specific piece of software, might be noteworthy to infect the host sharing this software, which could then be useful to at a later point in time assess whether from the attacker point of views which ones are valid targets. Credential reuse is also a thing. So many companies nowadays enforce multi-factor authentication on the entry points to the network, both in VPN or remote desktop. But just recently, in the past half year, there have been plenty of VPN gateways and remote desktop protocols appliances which had some severe flaws in there. And of course, if all those remote attacks fail, there's always the evil maid attack, where someone leaves their device unattended, like a notebook, like a smartphone, and an attacker is able to basically crack it open with physical access. Of course, doesn't scale that much in that someone has to physically go there, but still, depending on the attacker's scope, this is still a viable threat. Some newsworthy examples that have been related to ransomware. So Maersk was in 2017 hit with NotPetya. We had that already in a previous lecture. What they estimated is that they had more than $200 million in loss due to this software attack. There was Norsk Hydro. Early last year, there was infected. They had the problem that their plants and their distribution networks were affected, and they were so they produce aluminum, and if they cannot operate their plants and distribute the goods in the usual automatically approach, this of course also has millions and millions, caused millions and millions in damage. The Heise Redaktion in Germany was infected with Emotet. What I particularly like about this case is that they have been very open in their communication, just like the other ones. Openness wins sympathy, because then people can relate. They have been affected with Emotet, and I think nothing worse happened to them. And just last week, Soprasteria, French IT, gigantic company, IT company, was infected with Ryuk. And basically, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are many, many, many more infections with ransomware, and basically get extorted for getting the decryption key for their files. An observable trend in here is that malware as a service works. You could go to online forums, basically order a specific piece of malware and ship it to a victim that you have interest in. Usually nowadays it's not only about encrypting files, but also exfiltrating this data beforehand to blackmailing the company for data publication. So maybe they have offsite backups, maybe they can basically recover from that malware infection within a short time. But then an attacker could still blackmail them for releasing the data to the public. Basically, it's double the profit, even if there is a decryption key available for the malware. They are still likely, possibly able to pay the ransom because they wouldn't like to see their internal files leaked to the public. For keeping informed on these topics, many IT security companies, they have blogs and they openly share insights into how things happen today because they use it as a marketing vehicle. So both FireArm, Mandiant, all the names listed here, they again and again publish reports on both what they can observe in the wild and also specific analyses on malware strains that they have observed. Yeah. Usual ransom infection nowadays usually happens with Emotet. They send out vast and vast numbers of phishing emails. At a later point in time, once the any user opens the attachment and, for example, executes macros in the weaponized Office file, there's a second ransomware loaded, could be Ryuk, could be Conti, Trickbot, whatever it is, gets executed, and then the nasty things happen. You can read, for example, Microsoft has taken down or tried to take down the Trickbot network in October 2020, prior to the election of the US president, and they specifically stated the different steps they took, why they tried to take down Trickbot. In essence, they failed. So I think the Trickbot malware is still active because they haven't been able to shut down all the command and control hosts. And basically, it's ransomware as a service. So you can sell access to a company network for, depending on the size of the company, but usually in some suspicious forums, could get credentials that can give you access, can then deploy the ransomware there and either profit or not. Of course, strictly illegal, don't even try it. Some tooling that you would like to have knowledge about in this course, in particular, you should have heard of them. There's not the necessity to understand how they work, but you need to have the insight what they specifically do. A very powerful tool, Mimikatz, was written by Benjamin Delpy, Frenchman, who tried to figure out the different pass the hashes attacks and found out way more on the different golden ticket, whatever modern attack there is in Windows, it was implemented in Mimikatz. which makes it a very powerful tool. And if you observe Mimikatz in your network, it's a good thing to ring the alarm bells. PowerShell Empire was also powerful post-exploitation framework because PowerShell is installed with every Windows machine and also available on Mac and Linux. So it gives a very powerful framework to operate in once the initial exploitation worked. There's Cobalt Strike, which is basically command and control and post-exploitation framework as well, which is sold online for trainings, but source code has been leaked, so there are now numerous versions of that available. And there is Bloodhound. Bloodhound basically analyzes the Active Directory information on specific users and can then derive attack paths on whom to attack next to have the shortest path to domain admin privileges. All of them very powerful, all of them sufficient to talk an hour each about, but we're only covering it here very lightly. So some tooling, things that you would like to know about if the incident already occurred and you would need some software to help you in figuring out what happened and how it happened and where it happened. Basically, it's some open tools that have been published to the open domain, which work on the different layers of operating systems and networks. Many of them share similarities, but most of them share capabilities and how to use them in case shit hits the fan. So GER for most is GER Rapid Response. It's the incident response framework built and maintained mostly by Google. It's built for incident response in that every machine within the Google network runs it and allows for very quick responses in case suspicious traffic or things occur. Yeah, it's open source, it's written in Python, and it relies on lightweight local agents, meaning that every client has a local agent which is checking for tasks every, I think, 10 minutes to see if there is anything to do, and implemented specifically in a lightweight fashion. The really good thing about GER is that it scales tremendously. So if you have the backend infrastructure available, there are documented cases of instantiations of GER with more than 100,000 client machines. Yeah, basically it scales extremely well, and you can control 100,000 PCs easily with that. Yeah. In the daily usage, it provides a web GUI, meaning that you have a web interface. An analyst can use it to task clients specific investigations, and it collects the results and presents it within this web interface. Yeah, basically configuration is easy because everything is happening on the server side. So the server generates the binaries for all the different platforms and already pre-configures them. So all the clients have to do is basically install a binary. This binary is clickless, so you can just roll it out to all the clients and they will happily connect to the backend. Some of the cons, it's not strictly user-friendly yet, so there is a web interface, there is an API or multiple APIs available to do specific analysis tasks, but you have to train it, of course. It's not straightforward to use like any other website. The initial setup of the server can be tedious, so nowadays, of course, there's Docker, but for scalability, it can be tricky to estimate the number of clients that can use a specific hardware environment. And of course, there's privacy and legal implications. So Google rolls it out on their machines, but in Europe, where you have a Betriebsrat, a Workers' Council, and legal privacy implications and laws and rules. You cannot just simply roll this out to an entire company because it would be, strictly speaking, illegal. Yeah, already said, most of the logic is running on the server side. The server is generating the executables with the pre-configuration, and can be easily rolled out with Puppet or Active Directory group policy. Nice thing is also, if the machine is currently offline once a task has been scheduled, then it will be run as soon as the client appears online, meaning that if you scan the entire network of machines for a specific file name, if it can be found in the file system, and I don't know, 2 notebooks are currently in transit in the air and are unable to connect to the backend, then they will be tasked with these tasks once they are online and on the ground again. What they also derived, which is very interesting, it's like a middleware for forensic artifacts. So they abstracted between the different file systems, operating systems, the different artifacts. Basically, it's a YAML-based description on things like where commonly users store downloads, like from the browser, because it's different in Safari to Firefox to Internet Explorer. Whatever people are using for downloading software, it depends on the software used and the operating system. Yeah, it's also maintained in a separate Git repo. You can have a look there. What's really, really cool about GER is that it can, of course, acquire an image of the RAM remotely, meaning that you can task a notebook to send the content of the RAM over the network. However, just like Mark Rosinovich is now publicly showing on Twitter, they are running machines with more than 20 terabytes of RAM, and just transferring 20 terabytes of RAM is, even with a quick connection, still an amount of time. What GER allows is to use volatility on live RAM, which is really, really powerful. So instead of collecting all the RAM dumps from all the machines, you can just instruct them to use a specific volatility task, command, or plugin on live RAM, and this is really, really powerful. The basic work unit in GER is so-called flow. It's asynchronous, meaning that you task it, it will be shipped eventually, and once the responses are back, you can view them. Basically these flows instruct the agent to do a specific action, like check for specific files, or check for a volatility plugin if there are things in RAM currently happening. Basically, it's a small task written in Python, which is shipped to the agents. And it's also useful for baselining, where you say every hour I would like to have a list of all the running processes on a machine, and then compare it both in the breadth picture. You can print a histogram on how many processes a machine runs, but you can also track it over time to allow for sane baselines. Internally, GER is very, very powerful. Every message is timestamped. So data store is easily exchangeable. You can use basically any database that is currently cool and hip. Of course, Google uses internally their big table. Every message is timestamped. Everything is asynchronous, meaning that things are happening in order, but not instantaneous. Everything is signed and encrypted. Also important, because basically GER is the perfect command and control tool. And nothing is ever deleted, and files and chunks are deduplicated, meaning that if you task 1,000 machines to transmit a specific file, and they all have the same file, then it's only transmitted multiple times, but stored in the backend only once. Hunting is also possible with GER, so you can run a flow on the entire fleet. You can specify, hey, do you have that particular file, and this is then called hunting. Also, it scales, so if you task 100,000 machines to do a specific task, they will, within 10 minutes, basically check for task, run the task, and respond the results back. Security is also sufficient in GER. Basically, I'm not sure if it's still 1024-bit RSA. I think it's at least 2048 now. AES 256. Everything is signed and encrypted. You can use an offline machine for signing the binaries and signing the executables which are shipped. In essence, they have put a lot of thought into securing both the communication and the execution privileges that come with running GER in a production environment. What's also interesting, they have a performance watchdog, so if the local client uses too much resourcing, like content in RAM or execution time, it will kill itself and try again at a later point in time. Yeah, of course, you can export the data then again. Usually Google has BigQuery as their backend and can be configured to basically just download the data that has been retrieved. Another tool with similar mission or similar objectives is OS Query. It's basically allowing an SQL-like query language. It's providing this language to monitor systems and to detect intrusions. Also open source since 2014, and as I said, developed by Facebook. What you can retrieve from all the machines is like the running processes. You can get a list of file system changes, scan the client with Yara rules, and everything in configurable intervals. So if you have client machines and you would like to get a list of all the running processes once per hour, this is easily doable. This is what it looks like. You have the select some attributes from where some specific condition hits. In this particular example, it lists all the MAC addresses and IP addresses that the configured machines currently have. There's a nice article on Medium how Palantir uses OS Query and how they used it to figure out whether specific indicators of compromise are part of their network. Basically, they record plenty of events using OS Query, you can look it up. It's an interesting article on how it can be used for checking for specific artifacts in the network. Another powerful tool, this time a Linux distribution, is Security Onion. Basically, it's a toolkit for centralized network analysis and log aggregation. What it allows is to have it run on a server, have different log pipelines pipe into it to have a searchable stack of logs across the network. And it also allows to have different network analyzers running there. You can retrieve the PCAPs of a specific interaction and further analyze it using Security Onion. Very powerful, very open, very useful in productions. Another tool, I haven't had yet time to look into it, but it's called Velociraptor. It's made by Michael Cohen, who was one of the persons behind GER when he was still at Google. Basically, it's a another version of GER with a slightly different markup and a dedicated query language. So it's even more advanced, I would assume. As I said, I haven't tested it compared to GER to do interactive things. Yeah, it looks very promising, and Michael Cohen publishes plenty of blog posts and conference presentations about that. I would also look into that. If you would have to decide on a framework right now, have a look at Velociraptor. Of course, then there are also commercial tools available. So basically everything with security sells allegedly well. Perfect tool chain would support, of course, all operating systems, work remotely, little to no overhead. Yeah, basically they all are distinguishable in how they operate and what they do with the data, where they sit in the network. Do they need a monitoring port, or do they work on the hosts themselves? Yeah, the tools are available in all forms and flavors depending on the budget that you have. Some log-based tools, basically logs are generated by every PC. If you forward them and you aggregate them, you create pretty powerful insights into what the machines on your network are currently doing. Examples include Splunk or Palantir. Basically, they are specifically built for collecting logs and aggregating them. If you're more into agent-based solutions, basically IT security company is trying to sell their framework. Usually they run on the clients, often within the kernel, so you need super user privileges to install them, and they can access the information on the fly. So they're not limited compared to logs in that they only would like to analyze things that are pre-collected or pre-configured, but you can task them at runtime with collecting artifacts that aren't known beforehand. However, some of them might be bad for performance. So, for example, if you have developers and their compile time doubles by running such a tool, you wouldn't have much fame within developers. Yeah, Plazo and log2timeline, previously it was called log2timeline. Plazo is a powerful tool in that it tries to recursively exfiltrate or extract timestamp information from files, within files and within networks, wherever it is. So Plazo has the dedicated goal to take every timestamp available and bring it into a super timeline. Yeah, can be very powerful. Haven't used it myself, but if you are into timestamps, have a look at Plazo. Another tool then for aggregate those timelines is TimeSketch. It builds on Plazo and is basically made for collaborative timeline editing. Also done by Google, and it's probably much better than online Excel. This is what it looks like. You have specific events which can be filtered, can be annotated, and can be basically investigated. The problem TimeSketch had was that Google had on-call shifts around the world to have 24/7 coverage, and they needed a tool that allowed for collaborative editing without having to download a file or send files back and forth. They needed an online tool which can make handover to the next shift pretty easy. Getting a PCAP in intrusion detection can be useful as well. So if you suspect a machine to be doing some kind of malicious traffic, you would like to collect that traffic regardless if it's encrypted or not. In company networks, it's usually easy to get a mirror port or a spanning port. So network admins can configure a network port to be mirrored, either that of the specific machine or of the entire uplink, to basically allow to capture that data on that network port. But it could also be done on a budget. So for example, Netgear ProSafe switches, they cost, I don't know, 35 euro a piece, can be configured to do port mirroring in that they can duplicate traffic back and forth from a specific port and pipe it to another port where network interface in promiscuous mode could easily capture that traffic and store it to disk. There are also forensic network tabs available. I haven't used one of those yet, but they are rather expensive compared to having professional switching and routing equipment or having the budget option with reconfiguring one of those switches or routers. Yeah, in the cloud, this is kind of like a dark spot for me, but every cloud ecosystem has their own tools and insights how they can investigate or facilitate the investigation of events. So Azure, AWS, and Google Cloud, they have their own solutions to inspect suspicious traffic or suspicious activity. Not sure about how useful this will be for the future. Now everything is going serverless, Dockerized microservices. Yeah, it depends on what the context of your investigation is specifically, but all those modern toolings usually end at the latest technology. So I have no idea how to monitor self-hosted serverless interfaces. Never had to. Yeah, will be a bright and interesting future to say the least. With that, I'll leave it be. I hope you enjoyed the ride, and I wish you a wonderful afternoon, evening, morning, whenever you watch this. Stay safe. Bye.